16 minutes past 10. This is Kath Stanczyszyn on BBC Radio WM. Welcome to the programme. And we're starting off today talking about this. A Wolverhampton woman will speak at a public inquiry very, very soon this morning, along with other families who lost children in what's been called the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. Linda lost her son Michael in 1995. He was one of at least 175 children who were infected with HIV in the 1980s after being given contaminated treatment for haemophilia. That's according to documents seen by the BBC. Our health reporter Jim Reid has been following this story for a long time. He met Linda from Wolverhampton recently, and he spoke to me a bit earlier and gave us a little bit more of the background to the story.
What happened was in the late 70s, a new treatment for haemophilia became available. It was called Factor VIII, and it essentially replaced the protein that's missing from your blood that stops your blood clotting properly. So for the first time, you had thousands of haemophiliacs in the UK who could live pretty normal lives, because before that, if you had a fall or a scrape, if you were a bad haemophiliac, you would need some quite significant hospital treatment. So this was a revolutionary treatment at the time. And what happened was that the treatment itself was being imported towards the late 70s, early 80s, largely from America, because the UK at that time wasn't self-sufficient in blood products. And in the United States, it was being made from what's called pooled blood plasma. So that essentially means that thousands of people would donate blood, and all of those donations would go into one batch of this medicine. So you can see the possible danger there. If one of those people was positive for something like hepatitis or later HIV, when that became a problem, the whole batch of medication could be contaminated and infected. And that's exactly what happened. So from the kind of early 80s, just as HIV was becoming acknowledged as a virus and as a problem, you had haemophiliacs starting to fall very sick. And that's what happened to Michael. So we interviewed Linda from Wolverhampton, whose son was affected by this. And he started having treatment for haemophilia when he was 3 or 4 years old in the early 70s. In 1982, he was switched to this new American treatment. They started to realise there was possible problems around 84. So Linda was brought into Birmingham Children's Hospital, and there was a presentation talking about the risks of HIV/AIDS. But she was reassured at the time, and she said the nurses said, look, this is not something that you need to worry about too much. Michael is going to be fine. Very much reassuring kind of tones coming out. And then in 1986, just sort of out the blue, and around that time, Michael was 16 years old. So around that time, he was being called in because she thought they were going to switch his treatment from the Children's Hospital in Birmingham to what was then Queen Elizabeth, on its previous site before it moved to its current site in Birmingham. And she went into the room and she says, this is the point that the doctor told her that Michael was carrying the HIV virus. This is what she said to me in the interview.
The doctor, of course, he said Michael is HIV positive, and he just come out with it as though he was talking about the weather outside, you know what I mean? On the way home, I had to tell my husband when we got in the car, and he was silent all the way home. We never spoke. It was such a shock,
How did Michael react to being told that himself? Did he speak to you?
Well, he went very quiet. And he said he didn't want any family to know. He never told his friends or anything.
Oh, Jim, it's just devastating hearing that, and for so many reasons, and all the reasons with the context we have now, of course. 16-year-old, life ahead of him, with an illness that in 1986, of course, was very much the stigma and the sort of knowledge around it was different, but it was, basically a death sentence as well.
That's very true. And I think back at that time, you've got to remember so Michael was diagnosed in 1986. You picked up on the stigma of AIDS at that time. So in 87, beginning of 87, is when the government launched its Don't Die of Ignorance campaign on TV, which was credited with actually really bringing AIDS into the public domain, the public knowledge. But at the same time was fairly scary kind of marketing campaign. And some people think now, a lot of the families involved think did quite a lot to increase stigma of the disease. In 85 as well, so just before Michael was diagnosed, children with haemophilia were treated very differently. So there was a school in Hampshire where a 9-year-old, as a primary school, a 9-year-old was going who was a haemophiliac who tested positive for HIV. And other parents were pulling their children out of the school, saying they wouldn't send their children there and would send them to a different school. Now, it's very easy to be judgmental looking back, but as you say, this is a very different time when people were incredibly fearful of this new disease. There was no cure. There was no treatment. People didn't understand it really at the time. Even doctors didn't understand it. And that's why, as you heard Linda say there, that Michael decided he didn't want even some of his close family to know. His nan was never told, for example, because he was very close to his nan. And he didn't want his friends told. In fact, his friends didn't realise until after he'd passed away. And Linda was telling me that his friends then came up to her at the funeral. Incidentally, just as an aside, he was a huge West Bromwich Albion fan, Michael, and his friends all at his funeral all turned up in West Brom shirts to kind of commemorate his life. But going back to what Michael said, I asked Linda if, put all this together, how angry Michael felt as a 16-year-old and as a young man about being infected in this way.
Oh yes, he was. I mean, I tried to be so positive for him, to think that he wasn't going to pass away. And even in the hospital, the woman had him on one side and she said, Michael's going to die. And I said, no, he's not. Sorry. I've got a hank here. It's just seems like yesterday still.
Oh, it's just really hard to hear. Just the most awful situation. How old was Michael when he died, Jim?
So Michael was just a week short of his 26th birthday when he died. So that was in 1995. And I've covered this subject for quite a while, Kath, and it's interesting. There were some people infected as children that managed to survive long enough just until those antiretroviral drugs started to become available. And obviously now there is a very effective treatment for HIV/AIDS that essentially allows people to live normal lives. I know another man who's about my age, actually, I'm mid-40s, and he was infected as a child, and he now is married with a family and is able to live a completely normal life. But he at one point had very serious AIDS symptoms and was in hospital, but they just about managed to get this new treatment to him, so he was able to survive. For people like Michael, it's absolutely heartbreaking because they weren't quite able to do that. The drugs just weren't coming on stream fast enough, and that's why, there's some figures out that we found from the National Archives that at least 175 children were infected across the UK with HIV in this way in the 1980s. So actually, it's something we don't talk about that much. That's why there's this public inquiry at the moment. But it is very, very important, and actually one of the bigger treatment scandals we've had in NHS history. And I mentioned the public inquiry. So in 2017, Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, she announced finally a public inquiry into this whole scandal, which is much wider than just children being infected. We had 1,200 haemophiliacs in total were infected with HIV across the UK. And today is a very special session of that public inquiry, which is starting to draw to a close now. And they have a panel of people who lost children in this scandal, all speaking at the same time. It starts later. It starts this morning, and Linda is actually giving evidence for the first time today at the inquiry. I asked her why she felt that was so important.
I felt as though I needed to do it to help get to the bottom of it, because I think we all want to know why it was allowed to happen. I feel I need to help do something about it if I can. In any way I will.
Oh, that's our reporter, Jim Reid, from our health department at the BBC, who's been following this story of infected blood, and Linda, who lost her son Michael. He was basically given HIV from the blood products that were supposed to help him as a haemophiliac, and died in 1996. I think she's there now. Basically, that evidence is about to get underway. And, maybe we'll try and catch up with Linda herself at some point afterwards. But it's just such an incredibly sad story. There's still questions about when the authorities knew that was happening and why they didn't stop it a bit earlier. Of course, things have moved on so much. People aren't given often blood that's, actually from people. They are in emergency situations, but synthetic blood's made. They know to heat treat everything, so any virus in it, it wouldn't infect anyone else. So it wouldn't happen now, but it did happen then. And we thank Linda for doing that interview and sharing it with us as well. Just really, really sad.
A public inquiry will hear evidence today from families who lost children in what's been called the worst treatment disaster in NHS history.
I felt as though I needed to do it to help get to the bottom of it, because I think we all want to know why it was allowed to happen.
That's Linda from Wolverhampton. Her son Michael was diagnosed with HIV, aged 16 in 1986, having been given medication to treat his haemophilia, which contained contaminated blood. He died at Birmingham's QE Hospital a week before his 26th birthday.